are you going to do anything?
Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to the CTE today. My name is Sherry Grosso, and I'm the Associate Director of Distributed Learning here. And I am really happy to welcome Dr. Janet Hudson. She has a lot of experience in teaching online. She may not think so, but she does. And I really think she has a lot of things to share. And she started talking with you. I know that she does want to incorporate some conversation at the end of her presentation. So we're going to look forward to that as well. And I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about herself. So, thank you.
Janet Hudson. I teach history, American history, but I don't teach it in the history department. I'm a part of Extended University, which is a little-known unit in the university, but we do all kinds of things. And our mission is really outreach and providing opportunities for people outside the most traditional format. And in case you're not familiar with what the traditional format is, it's Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, in a 75-minute or less format. So I have taught online for 3 years, and this semester I've upped it to two more new courses and 2 at a time, which I've never done that. Never done either course, never done 2 at a time. And I've also taught blended. But I am in the humanities, and from what I've learned, that's not an area where a lot of people are in. More people are in professional schools. I think at USC there's a lot more in graduate than undergraduate. And so I'm doing humanities at the general ed, which is now Carolina Core level. So it is a different challenge. And I want to say that I'm going to try very hard not to generalize. I am speaking from my experience. And from that you can do your own translation and figure out what works for you. So please don't hear me telling you what to do. I'm just telling you what has been my experience. I have been to some conferences. I have done some reading in the discipline, but I'm going to try to not use any kind of professional jargon. You might welcome that, or you might wish that I did, but I'm just not going to. So I've tried to use this metaphor of translating. And so it's from face-to-face to online. And again, I don't know what you think when you think face-to-face, but this is my traditional experience. You have a classroom with students, they're there, have a professor standing in front of the students who are there. And this is somehow what you might imagine students do who are in a face-to-face class when they're not physically in the class, right? They're poring over their books, or they're sleeping because they're supposed to be poring over their books. And this is generally what somehow we imagine faculty do in preparation for face-to-face classes, pore over old books. So something like this maybe it's at least familiar to me. It's what I know. But when we start trying to imagine online, I think it's harder. It's harder to really even imagine it. And here might be some ideas. Students poring over a screen, particularly with math problems, sitting maybe in a public place, maybe in a private place, maybe alone, maybe with other people, but sitting with their technology. Maybe that's what they do, who knows? These are probably stereotypes or things that are hard to get out of our heads. You know, the traditional format, it's hard not to think about that. We're still in front of a group of people and we're still standing there. We're just pointing to the computer. And so, or that more negatively, that somehow the computer is doing the teaching for us. This is often how I feel. You're just talking to that student computer as you're reading that work. So I do think it's harder to visualize what online learning is about. So that we're sharing this metaphor, I want to just sort of tell you, is anybody, I missed a few of you, but anybody in foreign language? Okay, but we all know what translators are, so I'm thinking now the metaphor of translating as in foreign languages. So what do competent translators know? Most obviously they know both languages, right? You could not be a translator if you didn't know both languages. And they know that you have to provide the complete meaning, but you do not provide the literal meaning. And it's only the most novel student in a foreign language class that is, seeking for that literal meaning and not quite figuring out that when you say that the other language does something backwards, that it's saying something about you and not about the language you're studying. Cultural sensitivity. Competent translators know that this is essential because languages are embedded in a context, in a culture, and the words themselves have meaning in that culture, and sometimes it's hard to take that meaning somewhere else. So therefore, it takes some effort to think about that. Probably, I think the place that the world has suffered the most is when you're thinking about religious texts, which were written in a very, very different culture, and they're placed in a modern culture and taken in a quasi-literal way. That creates enormous confusion. And competent translators don't rely simply on themselves. They know that resources to enhance and extend their skills are available for them. Can't imagine translators don't use dictionaries. I'm sure they don't think that's cheating. So I want to take these now and think about it in terms of being competent at translating courses from face-to-face to the online format. So instead of the languages, you need to know something about both formats. I don't think it means you have to be an expert before you get started, but you need to know something about both formats. I think all of us are experts in the face-to-face format, but it takes probably not as many people in the other format. Same thing, you want to convert completely your face-to-face course, but not literally. And this is going to be the biggest because I think this is the most important. You want to show sensitivity. I'll elaborate in a bit. And you want to be able to access needed resources. So I want to explore each of these areas. Okay, to know both formats. Look at some online courses. And actually that's not the easiest thing in the world to do because most universities hide those. They're password protected. It's hard to actually get to see an online course. And I have not sure I've really ever seen very many. And I'm always asking, and they really are not easy things to see. But seek them out. Seek out, talk to people, ask people. People have asked me if I would add them to my course so they could look at it. So ask somebody to add you to their course. And it really is interesting to see that. Educate yourself about online learning. And again, there are endless resources, but like most things, that can be overwhelming. Just some of the things that are readily available here that I have used is the Chronicle has blogs, and you can subscribe to the digest, which comes right to your email every day. You can throw it away, you can look at it, you can mark it. But I do find that it's very valuable because you've got people right there on the cutting edge talking about something. There's something every week. There are multiple contributors. I find that that's a helpful resource. And then Tomorrow's Professor. That's also a digest. You don't have to subscribe. It comes to your email. You can throw it away. You can save it. You can scan through it, decide if you want to. But from time to time, they do have quite interesting things. And then they have an archive that you can access for past articles. So I have found that one to be helpful. And the CTE has a number of resources. Not to mention the people, but there are resources. And there are online resources for teaching online. And of course, endless bibliography. Take a course. Renee Schaefer offers one. You don't have to pay anything, you don't get credit for it, although you can get a certificate if you like. I took that before I taught, and she teaches it every summer, and she actually may teach it throughout the year, I'm not sure. But it is very valuable to be in a course, to go through the experience, to see what it's like, because it can quite frankly tell you what you're experiencing, the frustration that students are going to experience. Because there'll be something about it that you don't like, something about it you don't understand, something about it you could figure out some way to design better. And that's not a criticism of Renee, it's just how it is. So I strongly recommended taking some kind of course, being in one, not for the pressure of getting credit, but just so you have that experience, which will better help you think about it. So, know both formats. Now, converting, completely but not literally. I guess one temptation would be to just decide you could only take a slither of your course, that you could figure out one component, you do that. But I'd say don't fall to that temptation, that it's very possible to do an entire course. And embedded in this is an understanding that what we want is integrity in online teaching. I think that's probably what gives online teaching, what makes so many people skeptical of it. And there are, easy online courses. And I have students in my class who have had easy online courses. And they immediately are frustrated with me because it's not what they're expecting. And I'm not going to say anything, but oftentimes they've come from outside the university system. Increasingly now, students have high school experience with online courses. We know that there are for-profits in business. I'm not saying that they're bad. Community colleges do a lot of online teaching. Not every course that's taught in the world is rigorous. But of course, at a research university, that's what we want to offer. It's rigorous. So you don't want to offer a fraction, that somehow it's not equivalent to what students are getting in the classroom. But I think that this is the greater pitfall, is to think, and I know I did, those were the questions that I always asked. Well, I do this, how am I going to do that online? I give quizzes right there in front of people. How am I going to do that online? What about testing? Creates tremendous anxieties. Verification, cheating, on and on. Thinking literally about what you do and how you're going to do that in a format. So I would encourage you to recognize that you're doing that. I think, or again, I may not tell you what to do, or you may not think that at all, but I do think it's quite common. And this is a model of something that perhaps is very traditional. If the mode of teaching is conveying information to students in the old format, then that's going to be the model in the new format. How can we provide information to students? Good teaching, of course, is not really about simply providing information. Although I have found over the course of my teaching career, especially as I've questioned my teaching methods and I've modified them, and I look back at some of the things I used to do, I think sometimes I probably in the past put probably too much emphasis on conveying information. But now, as we all know, the world is not short of information, so we don't need to be simply conveying information. Just from my experience, when I used to approach a course, and I will say that I teach on a 4-3 course load. And prior to that, I taught on a 4-4 course load. And I've been teaching in that course load for the past 14 years. So I have prepared for class a lot. I have had that experience of thinking about what am I going to do with this course a lot. And I teach history, so I think for so many years, I get ready to teach a course, what am I going to cover? What's the course go from? I'm going to cover it. What are the readings going to be? Which books am I going to choose? How am I going to convey this very exciting, analytically sophisticated narrative? But I was still thinking of it in terms of covering and thinking about what material I was going to get the students to read. Test. How many were there going to be? How are they going to be spaced out? What else besides the test was I going to give? How much credit was everything going to count? So thinking about it from the mechanics is very much the most traditional way that I approach teaching for a long time. And in my head, I had the vision of what goes on in the classroom and how I prepare for that, and what students do outside the classroom, and how I'm trying to direct that. So in the classroom, outside the classroom, in the classroom, outside. And the language we use at the university, I think the laws are written around it. Contact hours. When you fill out the form to teach an online course, it tells you how are you going to meet the contact hours. So we have that model, that frame. And I'm not the best approach, okay? In fact, that has a lot of pitfalls if you're thinking about it. But these are the most traditional ways that I have thought about these. But as I've taught more online, I realize what makes it work better is to think, why would anybody bother? Other than the fact, okay, just let go of the notion that they have to have credit. But in the ideal world of why in the world it matters at all. And there might come a time when we really have to ask those questions. What can students do because they took this course? How did it matter at all to them? You know, did they get their money's worth? And in my discipline, these are the kind of things I want them to be able to do. Analyze, explain, apply, evaluate, create. And I really want students to be able to do that. So I have to think more. And I have begun to think more what I want them to be able to do. Then I have to think about how will I know that they can do those things. And am I not using jargon, which I know can become obstacles? I think if we're going to use jargon, what would we call the first one?
Learning outcomes.
Learning outcomes, right. But that really is a barrier to even begin to speak about that. So think about it in different language. And this is really assessment, right? But if I reframe it and think, and I'm very idealistic, I'll confess, and if I think about what it is that I want students to be able to do, and how am I going to know if they can do it, that really helps me. Then, how am I going to help them accomplish that? And then my role becomes clearer and actually a little more exciting than the other stuff. And this is my effort to explain or try to convey to you techniques for doing the other things. And this will be the closest I come to what I think is advice or what I have found to be helpful. Picturing the ideal learner. Not that you're going to have ideal learners in your class, okay? You can let go of that one. But picture the ideal learner. And the ideal learner is not a student in the honors college. It is not the student who scored 1,600 on their SAT. Those are different kind of students. This is an ideal learner. This is somebody who is motivated, who wants to learn. But what they need is expertise. That's what they don't have. They need expertise, but you clearly have. They need guidance, because the other ones don't need guidance necessarily. And they need feedback. They need to know, am I getting it? Am I heading in the right direction? I don't get it. Can you help me head in the right direction? And this is what makes teaching exciting. When you have ideal learners, people who want to learn, they need the expertise that you've spent a lifetime creating. And they need guidance that you have experience with. And they want your feedback. If you think about these things when you're designing a course, it really helps a lot. And I've certainly not accomplished it, but as I think more and move in this direction, I find that I am being more successful. And the second part of that is to picture yourself as the ideal learner, but not in your discipline, because you are an outlier in your discipline, right? You know it way better than other people do. You are the expert, so there's too big of a gulf. But obviously there are things in life you want to learn. There are things you don't know. And there are things that you need others' expertise, their guidance, and their feedback on. So think about when you're in those situations, what do you want? You probably don't want somebody to tell you, go to the library. They have lots of stuff over there. You probably don't want somebody to tell you, well, if you read the books on this 2-page bibliography, that will begin to give you some background in the area. You don't want that. That's not what you want. That's not what I want. You want the quick answer, right? You might want to work with other people and brainstorm. You might want feedback that you're not going to know about, right? That I can just test myself on. So I'll have to be embarrassed when, I realize I don't fully grasp it. So Think about the ideal learner and think of yourself, what it is you want. And that'll start giving you better ideas about what you need to do in your course. As I've tried to implement those ideas, I find that I do less telling. And that's very hard for a historian, because in history, part of what you're doing, and you may remember, you probably had a history course, the most traditional history teachers are constructing an interpretive narrative. We are using very sophisticated analytical reasoning, right? We're drawing upon resources. So it's not that it's simply fact, it's not that. But you're demonstrating it, right? The most traditional way in my discipline is taught, and the way I've taught for many years, is I'm just simply demonstrating what it is experts do, but not drawing attention to what the expertise even is, and not remotely trying to help you develop some of those basic skills. So I do less telling, and I try to do more focused telling. So that means less, and choosing what's really important. Now when I make a presentation, I really make myself not make it more than 10 minutes, and I try to keep it at 5. So try to be in that 5 to 8 minute range on a pointed topic, and it really makes me focus. And I'm less narrative focused, and that's a real tendency in my discipline. And I'm moving towards being more skill and assessment focused. And in history, it took a lot, this is where it took me a lot of almost like scholarly research to think about how it is. And I found some interesting scholarship in really, not a lot in this country, but internationally. There's a lot of look about what it is that historians really do in terms of thinking skills. And that has really helped me think about how to actually teach the skills that historians use, rather than simply modeling them, but all the stuff is behind the scenes and nobody really, only the brightest students really figured out what it was you were doing. And I do a lot less, I haven't cured myself, but I do a lot less information overload. And that's just something, if you end up using a publisher, that textbook publishers are now just pushing. They have so many online resources, and many of them are fabulous, at least in my discipline. But you talk about information overload, it would just drown you in information. I used to get, when I would first look at it, I would have to close it and just leave it, because it's like, I cannot, if I have to process all that, I just can't even think about doing this. So I can't even look at it, because I'll just be too depressed about the mountain I've got to climb. So I just can't look at it. So I think you've got to be, or again, dare I say that, I have found if I be selective, it works much, much better than just simply pointing to resources. Probably, and again, in graduate education, that's different. I'm focused, my experience is teaching general education to, undergraduates. So that is different.
He's all right across.
It's just, okay. They can be overloaded as well.
Very.
And I try to now put more on how to acquire and evaluate information for them, to know how to acquire the information themselves and how to evaluate it, because that's what's changing about the world, right? Information right here, right now, but what's quality information? I am a famous quizzer. I have quizzed and quizzed and quizzed, because I really want to motivate students to read, but I do less of that now. Quizzing for grading, and I have moved towards quizzing for self-assessment. And this is a brand new move, because it's with this semester. And the students have already been emailing me, and they're like, now I looked all over the syllabus and I didn't see what grade we're getting on the quizzes. Yeah, because you don't even have to take them if you don't want to. They're just for you. It's on the reading, because in the end, the skill they're going to have to demonstrate to me is going to require them knowing the material, and so they can figure it out along the way. So providing a resource for them to assess themselves along the way. Telling me what I told you. That again, I used to pretend like I didn't do that. Okay, it was hard to face the fact, But I was teaching history of a given, period of time. Again, it was very sophisticated. It was very interesting, right? Drawing upon a lot of resources. But in the end, when I looked at their tests, I really wanted them to show me they were listening to all that good stuff I was saying. I wanted them to have a lot of that stuff in there. So I wanted them to tell me what I had told them. I wanted them to listen to all of those things I posted and read all of those things. But now I am looking to see, are they applying the skill that I have taught them? Because when they leave, that's the skill that matters. Even if they remembered what a fabulous, explanation I gave of the election of 1812, and they understood all the ins and outs of it because they remembered everything I said, does that help them understand this election? Whereas if they have the skills to analyze political rhetoric, they can keep on doing that themselves. They don't have to worry about it if they memorize the stuff I said. And this was very hard for me, but I'm working on it. I told you that. It was on the syllabus. Why are you asking me that? But I've actually learned that I've started observing people, and I realize if you go to an airport, there's signs all over the place, and there'll be people asking questions about the sign that's right in front of you. When you go to a new place, sometimes you're overwhelmed by the information and you don't see the signs. People are different. They really are. Everybody's not slack just because they didn't bury down and figure out where that thing was. Sometimes you just want to know something quick. So I've realized that I have to provide the information in several places. And I have to be patient. Because, believe it or not, there's nothing unique to students. I mean, it's just amazing. Amazing. I mean, I'm on faculty committees, so I know that, that it's faculty sometimes who can't figure out things, okay, when information was right there. So you really do have to let go. I used to take those things so personally, like, oh, what's wrong with that? Or like if they asked the question, it was like criticizing me for not providing the information. Probably wasn't the reason. And this is the one I'm working on. I haven't gotten there, but this is my goal. Right now, I have students demonstrate their understanding in writing. Because again, that's what I've always done. That's what I know. That's what I feel comfortable with. But I want to move towards having them demonstrate their understanding by creating. And in history, of course, there are now endless tools on the internet. And I have seen some of them demonstrated. But I have assignments that require students to provide leadership and do an evaluation, and they tell me again and again, when they have to provide a leadership role, it really makes them learn the material more because they feel, they don't want to mess up in front of their peers. So I've realized that if they have to create something to explain that a demonstrated skill, that's a very effective way of learning. But of course, it's something I'm not experienced at. It requires me learning stuff. So it's a goal that I haven't gotten there yet. Okay, show sensitivity. The world is changing. I don't need to say, I'm saying that, but you know it. I have watched it in the classroom change really, and this is anecdotal, but since smartphones have proliferated, I really think the classroom experience is very different than it used to be. And some of the formats I teach in are to teach for 3-hour blocks and at night. And it can be a real challenge to find a wide variety of things to do to keep people's attention. And it's just harder than it used to be. I really do think that it's just different. Things are changing. And I won't overwhelm you with the data, but it's changing even more at the secondary level and elementary level. Pretty soon, the students who come to us, we're still living with students who are going through the transition themselves. And you'll know in your classrooms it's very mixed and has been. But soon, we're only going to have students who have learned in a different way. If we're not prepared to teach them, then, what's that going to say about our relevance? And our ability to Right. Connect with the things that we know that really matter. Modes of information retrieval. Again, a very obvious thing, but you have to show sensitivity to that when you design your courses. I'm sure all of us have spent times in our life where we gave people directions based upon, physical markers, and you wrote down directions, and you might have emailed directions, and those days are gone because most people have ready access to GPS, and I actually see students walking around, trying to follow their GPS directions. It's uneven, right? That's just one tiny example of how the modes of information retrieval are changing. But it changes the way people interact. My husband and I always talked about our kids. We are big planners, have to make a plan. What time we're going to meet you, where we're going to go, and you just go with the plan. And as they were adolescents, they didn't do that. Everything just evolved because you were just looking to see the plans that were unfolding. And that's just a tiny example, but it's the way in which culture changes as technology changes. The way people learn really is changing. So therefore, the way we teach has to change. And the role of social interaction. And I am not here to tell you that you have to use Facebook and Twitter. This is a link to a website that, well, maybe I'll see if it. It's just maybe you can look at it. What this is really illustrating, this came from a conference, really, strangely enough, on Blackboard. Really wish they'd get with the plan. And the gist of these things are that social networking, Facebook, Twitter, are often tools used in a social realm. But increasingly, as these modes of information retrieval and modes of interaction change, then people are going to need to have, and they do, I think now, need social networking for learning, social networks to learn in. Doesn't mean they have to mix and mingle with their purely social networks, which means we'll have to come up with new words for that, right? But that's part of what we can do as online teachers, classroom professors, is create those electronic communities that are for learning. So building in a component of your course that is social, and again, I'm not saying social in terms of talking about your weekend. I'm talking about interacting, and that is probably, and several people I've talked to who teach online, that is probably one of the things in which online teaching is most successful, because you get I find in history, you get much more quality responses in discussions online than in the classroom. For one thing, in the classroom, you're stuck with kind of extroverts participating more than introverts, and whoever's participating is kind of the thoughts that you can form right there. And not everybody thinks well on their feet. Not everybody can respond well when a student makes a comment that they disagree with. They just kind of have an emotional reaction, but it takes longer to think about it. Whereas online, a discussion can fold over time. You're expected to respond with quality response based on the content. And I have found very meaningful discussions, and students who aren't extroverts, who have been very reluctant to ever participate in class, talk about how much more they like that component. And the last one, of course, is to relieve any anxiety you might have, and that's to realize there are endless resources that you should access. And I don't know what your level of comfort with technology is, but I would say if you're going to develop an online course, to focus on the content and the intellectual approach you want to take, which really should be different than how it is in face-to-face. Because, and I was told this before, and I just kind of thought, right. And I really actually thought it was just one of those things people were saying so that you wouldn't feel overwhelmed. And I have spent a lot of time trying to learn, and I am not a person who has really unusual expertise with technology. So it's labor intensive to learn those things. But what I discovered is if I'd learned something new, if I didn't have some content to test it on, it wasn't any good. And I learned that I can rely on other people's expertise to help me, whereas I'm the only one that can do the other piece. So thinking about, and there's plenty of work involved in doing this, but thinking about how to convey the content in a different way and developing that content is the primary thing to do. And now that things are far more sophisticated, there are so many things that can be done that if you know there's something you want to do, someone with expertise can help you, like Mike, right? He can tell you. And the great thing is, you know, when you're teaching, there's these things that you do really well, and every year you do it for the new group of students. You can spend 2 hours giving a lot of thought to how you want to develop a presentation of that great thing you do that might only take 5 to 10 minutes. But then once you produce it and create it, it's there. It's there again and again and again. And I've discovered once I find a way to teach this skill, when I read a paper and it's not there, I say, go review. Whereas once you taught it in class, you're not going to teach it again if they didn't get good notes, if they missed class. So there are ways in which it's far more valuable. And your expertise can be used in valuable ways. And of course, you're going to be partnering with a course designer. And if you actually get one of the grants that are available, that's going to be a requirement. And Mike is one of the course designers. And that helps a lot on the side that you might be less familiar with. So that's back to my overview of these. So tell me about questions you have, experiences that you have.
What is a logical number of students to have?
Well, I know for a fact that there are courses taught here in USC that are in the hundreds. I know that. And I teach classes in the 35 to 40 range. And I don't think it's the fact that they're superhuman and I'm not, but it's just a different approach. So depending on the number, depending on the approach, depending on if you have access to TAs or not, the approach is going to be very different depending on the size. So I just don't think I could answer the question. It probably depends on the discipline, but it is not uncommon to have very large classes. That's not my experience.
Just related to that, I would guess that one big difference in the size is ultimately the assessment method. I
Yes.
certainly understand what you say about giving them some things to let them self-assess, but ultimately we're responsible for signing it in through out, and there has to be something that we can defend about our assessment.
That's right. And I think you might, some people might be experimenting more with face-to-face assessments in classes with large numbers online, where it's not, where the assessments are online. But and some disciplines will probably lend themselves better to machine-graded assessments. I don't use machine-graded assessments, so it would be much, much harder to do that. I did go to a conference where people talked about having assistants who did engagement, like with the discussion groups, where you could actually farm that out. I think that probably nationally at some levels, people are hired to do components of providing that feedback. But that is huge. I mean, that's huge, the assessment method. Yeah.
I want to back up just a bit and actually get a definition of online learning. Let me just say what I think is correct is, I would think that each learner would be in their own separate pod, sitting in their own room, as opposed to a cluster of even 3 or 4 of them sitting around together. Okay, so they might be completely disconnected physically. And I also assume that your online content is delivered in some time frames. Here's the first encounter, here's the second, here's the third. Students are expected to engage with that within a certain time window and then go on from there. Is that correct?
Right. Those are excellent questions. And again, there's endless variety. Generally, there are asynchronous and synchronous approaches. Synchronous means that people are all meeting at the same time. and there are methods and technologies for doing that. Asynchronous is where that does not happen. And then there is the self-paced approach, which I do think is the less common, but often students expect it. And then there is the not, where there is a given time frame, there are modules. I do happen to use the model where I have a module for a week. It's only available for a week because part of the requirements are the interaction with other people, so it wouldn't work for a self-paced approach. So again, that depends on what your objectives are, what it is you're trying to. So there are many varieties of doing that, absolutely. To provide the most flexibility, though, asynchronous is really the approach to providing the greatest flexibility.
With your modules, do you still focus on the chapter in the textbook? Yours is history's linear, unless you're teaching periods when you're reaching even now. But is the module covering chapter 1 as if you were teaching a live course in this week covering chapter 1, or do you go more on content and then go a grading? I'm trying to make sure that the students are not confused about how to use their textbook. It's easy in a live class, pretty much, but I'm a little stuck there in terms of how to set it.
Well, I think there would be endless choices. I can tell you what I do is I'm not a heavy textbook user. I try to make the module around a concept, and then I provide resources and activities, and the textbook I will reference as one of the resources. And in one course now I'm using a free online textbook to see how that goes. On the other I'm using the more traditional approach. So I think it depends on your discipline and how you want to do it. But you clearly have to provide content, and it's important to provide it all in the same place for them. If you can think about it, if you have to go to 500 different places, that's too confusing. If you want them to go online, that's fine, but provide a link to get online. If you have resources, provide a link. Blackboard, of course, contains that in what they call folders. So there are ways electronically to make things readily accessible for the students. I tend to separate the directions from the content, but making all that stuff very clear. So if your discipline is driven by chapters, I wouldn't call them chapters, I'd call them whatever the concept is, and whatever things you might use, some, professor direction, what the assessment for that unit would be.
I have not taught an online class, but we have a distance learning in communication sciences and disorders. We have equal numbers of students in distance learning and in the on-campus program. And it seems like what I hear, and my impression is that one of the challenges is giving the students, the distance students, enough time and accessibility since you don't see them in class. So you can't say, oh, I'll address it on Tuesday. But also protect your non-teaching time, since it seems that a lot of these students will email you as soon as they come up with a question, not necessarily during your office hours. Mm-hmm. And because these students, a lot of them work and have kids, they may be doing this at 11 o'clock at night. So you want to be responsive, but yet you don't want to be a slave to your email and be overly and so do you have any recommendations on how to handle that?
Well, I think the other thing that makes online different is that when you're doing face-to-face, you can kind of be flexible as you go along. With online, you really, before the semester starts, everything has to be laid out, which is what makes doing one far more difficult the first time. And you have to anticipate everything that you can imagine and create directions for those in several places. And that is hard. I mean, that's time consuming. And I think there are resources for helping with that.
But no, I was going to say, that's one thing that really does cut down on the questions that come up that, in the classroom you can address, but you anticipate those.
And when you get experience, you kind of learn what they are. And I've discovered, if you discover that there's a problem, I will actually send an email out with oftentimes a voice, explanation or a visual explanation to everybody. You can post it someplace. I've created small groups and say, when you first have a question, go to your group, because somebody there might help you more quickly. Then, if you've looked in the directions, if you talk to one of your peers, then ask me. And I said I've taught for 3 years, and I have not been overwhelmed with that problem. The key, though, is anticipating problems, because once a problem emerges, there'll be, 20 people who want to tell you about that problem, and that's what becomes overwhelming. Or if there's something that you haven't anticipated, it's not clear, they get frustrated. So that's why the thinking ahead of time, anticipating it, structuring it, being clear, those are enormously important.
Grad students are very thinking in our program. They come up with a lot of questions, a lot more than the undergrads. So.
Yeah, and that could be true. And
it's good.
And you
They're
could
good
put,
at
and
answering.
if every question is unique, that's hard. But once you've answered the question,
So what
post it
about-
in a common place, like all frequently asked questions.
What about the first 2 or 3 times you teach it, before you figured out all the things? I mean, it's easy to say, well, you'll figure it out as you do it. But what about like the first time you teach an online class?
Well, I would say you still give them a frame, a time frame that you'll respond to. I mean, yeah, you're tempted to think, oh my gosh, I have to answer right away. But, say you'll answer within 24 hours on weekdays, or not, But if you give them that framework, I think that is understandable.
Yeah, you definitely don't have to be available 24/7. You don't. And I really think you'll figure out a pattern. If there's a pattern of a particular student who asks a lot of questions all the time, then that can be less urgent response to that. And there again, this is a philosophy people have. A lot of people don't like to respond immediately. I have found if I reply pretty quickly, it's easier to solve the problem quickly, because the longer it takes for me to reply, the more frustration builds up, the more confusion, the more things that happen in the meantime when the problem hasn't been solved. But I know that not everybody feels that way. But it's just been my experience to reply quickly. It works out better.
When you're feeling your way through, that if you go ahead and say, one of your colleagues asked a very good question, and then send that to everybody. I save that because I'll forget it next time if I don't have it. I mean, it's a decision as to whether how much needs to be embedded in your syllabus or someone else.
One of the things that we've recognized technically that work very well for some classes is they actually set up a Q&A board in Blackboard, which is pretty much student run. You open it up for students to post questions and for other students to answer them. Some faculty and undergrads have actually gone as far as to say, if you're the first person who answers it correctly, you get an extra point.
Yeah.
That encourages people to use it, but in several grad courses, it's been used extensively successfully. Student posts a question, other students open it. You as faculty have to go in and monitor how it is looking at, but it really takes a lot of pressure off of you having to respond to these.
Yes.
Have you generally found Blackboard to be sufficiently flexible and functional to support?
I have. It is labor intensive, and that's what's frustrating about Blackboard. Well, and just everything, you have to go into every little thing. And I've learned more and more. The more you learn about Blackboard, the more you realize there are more tools to help you. There really are. I mean, Blackboard isn't, I've had students tell me when they come that I've never seen a Blackboard class like this. So and that's not to say I'm great, it's to say it has a lot of capacity, but I think a lot of faculty don't use it, so some students don't see the wide variety of flexibility that it has. So it really can do a lot, and they're constantly improving because they have competitors and they need to keep up with things.
Do you, or do you recommend, once, let's say your lecture module is set up, just porting that forward and using that from semester to semester and then focusing on questions and answers and assessment type things?
Well, again, I would encourage you not to think about the lecture you traditionally give and giving that as a lecture. Students will not watch 20, 30, 40-minute lectures.
Right.
So they've got to be focused on what am I explaining, and in your discipline, think about, okay, if I were explaining this, it takes 10 minutes explaining this, and then those are called reusable objects. So if you explain this one thing, you might combine it with this the next time, but those definitely are portable things that you will use again and again and again.
What I'm experimenting with right now, I'm supporting a freshman course with 100-something people, and we're trying to make it meet the speech requirement for the Carolina Core. So there's a main instructor, but we're trying to get this one approved for the Carolina Core. And I promise to deliver the speech instruction. So I have about half a dozen 10 to 15-minute bits
Yes.
in mind that I'm working on, a combination of pre-recording and PowerPointing. It's fairly low-tech, but it's a start. And then I'm thinking, once those are done, and they're not hour-long lectures, here's something about speech, here's something, listen to this, and then, that relates to your assignment.
Exactly. And then if you can provide assessments inside of those, you've watched this 10-minute thing, do you understand that there's an assessment? Yes. Those are, and then try to make them where they're not time specific, then you can use them again and again. And that's the type of thing that is very valuable and portable for other courses.
I guess it goes in what the gentleman was asking. Do you have some recorded lectures that you have actually put your voice in, practiced making it exciting? It's like, hello, hey, how are you doing? Have you done those?
Oh, yes. But I'm not promising you that they're exciting. But this is what I have learned. I use Presenter, PowerPoint. It's a plug-in to PowerPoint. It's called Presenter. I've also used Captivate. And Captivate is far more sophisticated, but it's along similar lines. These are both Adobe products. And what you do is you create your PowerPoint, and then you have voice over. And it is vital that you speak in not a machine voice.
Right.
It's the way you engage your material with modulated voices, focused on this. The PowerPoint has visuals, and I noticed that coming soon there's one about how to excite your visuals. They cannot constantly be bullet points. They just cannot. I've got this point, I'm going to read it to you. I've got this point, I'm going to read it to you. Thinking conceptually, not that I accomplished it, but I started out with a bullet point, and I kind of think, what am I trying to do? This is the biggest point I want to make. This is what they have in common. Thinking visually how to conceptualize your material, providing sometimes one good visual that you can then reference, and it repeats, and you draw it together, and you elaborate. So I think that those things are really important ways. How can I convey this particular thing? And yes, and it's horrible to listen to myself speak. I've realized, oh my goodness, it is just so painful. And I does sound like the most inarticulate person. And the good thing is you can edit some of it. But I just finally have to say, well, people have been hearing that for decades. I'm just now coming to grips with it. But that's how it is.
I don't want to keep anybody if you have to go, but I want to thank Janet so much. I think this is really good. Please stay if you have some more questions. Before you go, if you would, fill out the evaluation for us, and make sure you take the calendar because we have a lot of really good events coming up. So, but Janet said she could stay for a little bit, so please continue to ask questions if you can. Thank you.
I missed what discipline you're from? Journalism.